92nd Street Y online media is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. This program features Governor Mario Cuomo, Ari L. Goldman, a New York Times reporter who wrote The Search for God at Harvard, Madeleine L'Engle, author of the children's book A Wrinkle in Time, and moderator Roger Rosenblatt, reflecting on the question, who is God? It was recorded on October 15th, 1991, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
Ordinarily, before speaking in public, I say a little prayer that I won't make a fool of myself. And if I do make a fool of myself tonight, at least we will know that God has a sense of irony. Our rules are very simple. This is not a competition among witnesses to see who is right. As far as I know, we will receive no visitation to disprove or prove anything here. We are lucky to have three thoughtful, brilliant people who will talk about their God, their personal, not necessarily in personal experience, but their own way of looking at God and at deity. I will introduce each one individually, and each one will speak for a certain amount of time. Then at the end of all three presentations, we would be happy to have questions. So first, let me introduce Madeleine L'Engle. Madeleine L'Engle was born here in New York City, spent part of her childhood in Europe, returned, much to our pleasure, graduated from Smith College. After a number of publishers, a great number of publishers, she tells us, rejected A Wrinkle in Time. Finally, Farrar, Straus and Giroux had the good sense to do it. It won the Newbery Prize. And it is, you should pardon the expression, a godsend to every parent in this room and throughout most of the world. She's written 37 books and, sorry? 42. She's written 42 books. I guess we waited longer than I thought in the back. And she did, part of her charming description of herself includes the fact that she likes to cook for 15 to 20 people at a time, but that she doesn't like to wash up, thus proving she is a true writer indeed. Madeleine L'Engle.
We always have to have a piece of paper just in case. My first awareness that there was a God who mattered to me came before I was old enough really to be aware. I was a baby visiting my grandmother at her beach cottage in North Florida. And it must have been an absolutely gorgeous night for somebody to say, let's wake up the baby and show her the stars. So somebody came and untucked the mosquito netting from around my crib, and I was carried out in somebody's arms, and there, above me, was all of that glory. It was my first glimpse of night, my first glimpse of the universe, my first glimpse that there was more to the world than the tiny world that I had heretofore known as a child. Now I was too young to be able to formulate this in words, but the memory of it, the feeling of going out and seeing those stars has never left me. And when I need God, if I can go out and see stars. When I was working on my first novel right after college in the summer here in New York City, I would take the subway up and go to the planetarium just to see stars. When my children were little, when I was having my children, my husband and I lived for nearly 10 years in a small dairy farm village in New England. My husband was an actor, and he left the theater forever, which, thank God, only lasted for 9 years. And during which time we had our kids, our 4 closest friends died, which is statistically a lot of death. One bad thing happened after another. And when things got really bad, I'd pile the kids in the car, and we would go up to the top of Mohawk Mountain, the tallest mountain around us, and wait for the stars to come out, and try to set whatever it was that had happened in the context of a God who created all of that marvel lovingly and with a purpose. And I think it was from my son, the youngest, that we were talking about what God's body was like. And from him came the idea that God's body is all of the galaxies, all of the stars, all of that glory. And if we have to have a metaphor, a visual image, I like that, because that means we are part of it. Now, this is a very great cosmic God I'm talking about. And reconciling the master of the universe with a personal God who truly cares about every single one of us, who knows about every single one of us, is a paradox I don't even try to explain, because most of the important things in my life are expressed in paradox and contradiction. And so God for me is this marvel, this maker of the universe, this creator of the wonders, and yet a God who cares. And I keep finding out about what I believe as the events of my life come. And the winter after my husband died, I took my 18-year-old granddaughter down to North Florida, where my mother's family came from back in the early 1500s. That was the first part of this marvelous country to be settled. And we went out to Fleming's Island, and Fleming is a family name, and we went to St. Margaret's Church, which is a beautiful little Carpenter Gothic church, just the right size. It holds about 100 people, that's all. I think that's a perfect size. And behind and to the side of the church is an old graveyard in which quite a lot of my forebears are lying. And it's shaded by live oak trees, and there are azalea bushes and mockingbirds singing, and it's a very peaceful and lovely place. And I'd been there many times before, but suddenly, standing there with my granddaughter, I realized that all of the people who were lying in those graves had been planted there in the sure and certain assurance that those actual bones, body, blood, muscles, veins, skin, all of that stuff, was going to rise up again at the last day. And Christians could not be cremated because God is not powerful enough to do anything with ashes. Well, my husband, at his wish, had been cremated, and I'm quite convinced that God is powerful enough to do anything needed with ashes. And I stood there and thought, we have not moved in our thinking about this since the days of Queen Victoria. And it's about time we did some new thinking. That's a very puny little God that has nothing to do with the mysterium tremendans et fascinans that lights my life. What happens over and over again is that we see God anthropomorphically, and because we are human beings, that is almost inevitable. And it's all right as long as we realize we're being anthropomorphic. Montaigne said, "Oh, senseless man who cannot make a worm and yet makes gods by dozens." And we do that. And I'm appalled by the number of people whose image of God, and this is a very strong and powerful image, is Moses. And Moses in a bad temper at that. And now we have the arguments about God's sex, and we have God as mother as well as father. We have her as well as him. And I'm not sure whether it's the Virgin Mary in a pale blue dress or the warrior goddess, but it's still anthropomorphic. For me, it still doesn't work, because I have never thought of God in terms of male or female or sex. And sometimes revelations come to us in strange places and at odd times. Last July 28th, I was being driven from San Diego up to Escondido, California to do a lecture, and a truck went through a red light and smashed into the little car that I was in and totaled the car and nearly totaled me. And I came as close to dying as you can come and not die. And when I came out of the surgery, I thought, oh, I am still here. This is interesting. I wonder why. And for a long time, I was too weak even to hold a paperback book. I couldn't read, and all I could do was lie there and think. And I suddenly got my metaphor, the metaphor that works for me. And that is the metaphor of myself as the unborn child. And the unborn child has no sensory knowledge of the mother who nourishes it. There's no picture of the mother. But all that child gets for life is from this unknown source. And I thought, that is a good metaphor for me, because God is for me, because I am finite, an unknown source. I cannot comprehend the infinite. I can be in awe. I can rejoice. I can hope to remain open so that as we learn more, that I'm able to allow my metaphors, my images of God to grow and to develop. The one thing that has remained always for me standard is that God is love, and that love embraces everybody, that nobody is excluded, that this is an all-inclusive love, and it is richer for me because of that inclusiveness. There are two very tiny little Hasidic stories that will tell you everything I believe about God. They're about a wise old rabbi, and a student goes to him and says, "Rabbi, in the old days, there were people who walked and talked with God. Why doesn't anybody do that nowadays?" And the rabbi said, "Well, nowadays, nobody can stoop so low." The other one is the same rabbi. He's in his study, and a student sees him and bursts in and with enthusiasm says, "Rabbi, I love you so much." And the rabbi says, "My child, do you know what hurts me?" And the student says, "Rabbi, I just wanted to tell you how much I love you, and you confuse me with irrelevant questions." And the rabbi said, "My question is neither confusing nor irrelevant, for if you do not know what hurts me, how can you love me?" And that tells me everything I need to know about God, the God who has lit my life in the dark places, and probably more brilliantly in the dark because the candle shines more brightly at night than it does in the daylight. I'm grateful to the Mysterium Tremendum at Fascinans, and I hope to go on learning every day of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Ari Goldman was educated at Yeshiva University and later at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Joined the New York Times in 1973 and has covered education and state politics and now religion. He is the author of a much-praised book last year entitled In Search of God at Harvard, a quest that most people at Harvard would regard as a lead pipe cinch. Ari Goldman.
So who is God? In a strange sort of way, I feel I've been preparing for this speech my whole life. I like the question. I do not find it daunting. I like it because it begins with a presumption I share. The question is not, is there a God? The question accepts the fact of God, but just asks, who is this God? I make my living as a reporter. And in this job, well, it's my job to observe the world and to write about it. After doing this for 16 years, I trust my judgment. I think I'm a good witness to life. And so the best way I can begin to define God is to describe the God I have seen and heard and glimpsed and felt. So let me begin now at my beginning. No canopy of stars here, but a bed. Like Orthodox children everywhere, the first prayer that I was taught was Shema Yisrael. It is the Jewish monotheistic creed, a declaration of the oneness of God, and it is said most memorably at night in bed, just before going to sleep. My parents said it with me. I say it with my children. And more than anything in my young life, it was the Shema that gave me a sense of God, putting God right there on my pillow with me. For me, then, God is a fact of life. You don't see him, don't taste him, don't feel him, but God is there with you and that is an indisputable fact, and that fact is comforting, particularly in the dark. My first point at pinning down this God that we are seeking is that God has a presence. God is there. I am 4 years old, playing in the synagogue in my favorite hideaway under my father's broad white tallis, the fringed prayer shawl, as it sweeps back and forth with the rocking of his body. I look up at the woolen fringes as they fly past my face, and I see that they are aglow. The dull wooden fringes have taken on a glowing mist, a sheen that is otherworldly. That is God, I whisper. I reach out my fingers and catch the fringes and hold them to my face. But the glow is gone. The fringes look dull in my hand. I am 5 years old, and I am sitting at a table covered with white as my mother lights the Sabbath candles on a Friday night. 5 candles, one for each member of our immediate family. As the flames flicker and then take hold, blue at the wick and white at the crown, I notice a haze, a kind of halo around each candle. There's God, I whisper. I blink, and I blink again, and the halo is gone. Optical illusions? Could be, but that's not important. I have established and believe that there are realms of holiness, realms of the sacred, realms of God that we can see. But God is elusive. Try to hold him, and he's gone. So who is God? A presence and an elusive vision. And on your pillow, good company. My concept then, not surprisingly, is a Jewish concept of God. Not an old man with a white beard, not a big brother with luminous eyes, no form, no body, no gender, but a powerful, mystical, and ultimately knowable presence. Of course, language fails when we start to talk about God, and so we fall back on words like king and ruler and father and almighty. Because human language is limited, we often fall back on calling God him. Often, but not always. In Judaism, there's also the notion of the Shekhinah, the spirit that is the feminine presence of God. This God of mine takes on different forms, male and female and inanimate. God in the candles, God in the prayer shawl. But mostly, God is in the doing, in the sacred acts of people like you and me. Man brings God to earth by putting on the tallis. Woman brings God to earth by lighting the candles. At least that is what my Rebbe, Rabbi Siegel, taught me in high school. He rarely spoke of a God in heaven, but of a God who we bring to earth by doing. This is all very neat, maybe a little smug, a little naive. You may be saying, this personal chameleon God who can turn on, who I can turn on and off at will. He is what I want him to be, where I want him to be, or what I want him to be. I am, of course, ignoring the God of history, the God of creation, the God who allows evil to happen for this warm, fuzzy presence. I'm also ignoring the Christian God of love, the Muslim God of justice, the Buddhist gods of serenity. So let me take my God concept one step further to a religious challenge to the God who sits on my pillow and hangs around my candlesticks. I've written about this in my book, The Search for God at Harvard, which is about a year that I spent on a leave of absence from the Times to study comparative religion at Harvard Divinity School. Madeline L'Engle said, "Are you going to read from your book?" And I said, yes. At least it's not plagiarism. But in a chapter called First Days, I write about being uncomfortable with all the God talk at the Div School, as we called it. My religious life is much more fixed on doing, but here everyone was talking about God. Curious and open to new experiences, I planned to check out a course on contemporary thinking on God. I was walking down the hallway of the Div School on my way to sample a class called Constructing the Concept of God, taught by the Christian theologian Gordon Kaufman. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw my Rebbe, Rabbi Siegel standing in a doorway, dressed as a clown. His mouth was circled by big red lips painted sloppily over his black beard. His voice sounded like the canned laughter pouring out of the carnival funhouse. Look at this, he said, rocking back and forth, waving the Divinity School catalog in the air. Constructing the concept of God, he read, holding the catalog up to his nose. The intention of this course is to encourage students to examine critically their own thinking about God with a view to reconstructing it appropriately for contemporary life. When he pulled the catalog from his face, the smile and the clown outfit were gone. Rabbi Siegel stood there sternly before me in his black suit. Reconstructing God, he boomed. You want to know who God is? God created heaven and earth. God split the Red Sea. God made water flow from the rock. God saved your parents from the flames of Auschwitz. But he didn't do it so that you could come here to this unholy place to reconstruct the image of God. I turned and ran down the hall. Despite my flight in the course of the book, I began to appreciate and assimilate other understandings of God, both contemporary and ancient. My concept of God grows through the experience. I can accept that for some, God is a man who walked on earth. I can accept that for some, God dwells in a statue of clay. But most of all, through the Divinity School experience, my antenna for the godly grows. I still see God in my father's tallis and in my mother's Sabbath candles. But I also see God when the Dalai Lama puts his hands together like this. God is right at the edges where the fingers come together. And I see God in the kind blue eyes of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I see God in the blessings that fall from the Pope when he makes the sign of the cross from the balcony overlooking St. Peter's. I see the glow of the sacred, and this is no optical illusion. I am seeing the very essence of God. In synagogues around the world last Saturday, Jews read the great biblical story of Noah. Noach ish tzaddik. Noah was a righteous man, a man of God, the Torah says. God talks to Noah and gives him very precise details about the building of the ark. So many cubits by so many cubits. And God tells him, Tzohar ta'aseh teva, literally make a window for the ark. In the Talmud, the rabbis debate what this window was all about. One rabbi says, well, it was kind of like a skylight on top of the ark, and the sun poured in. But another rabbi says, this is no conventional window. The light source aboard Noah's great ark was a brilliant gem, a diamond so bright that it lit the entire boat, bringing hope to all of its inhabitants. I believe that all holy men and all sacred acts carry a magical diamond of this kind, a light that is nothing less than the spark of the divine. If we keep our eyes open, wide open, we can see this manifestation of God. And if we magnify this 1,000-fold, we can begin to understand who God really is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Mario Cuomo is in his third consecutive term as governor of the state of New York. Born in New York, educated in public schools in St. John's College and St. John's Law School. He was an adjunct professor of law while practicing law before entering politics. He has distinguished himself as the governor and as a politician, not only by his ability, but by his willingness to tackle difficult, problematical questions, such as the one tonight. He still thinks of Queens as heaven, even though a bishop from time to time will consign him elsewhere. Mario Cuomo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Ari and Madeline, for two brilliant and inspiring presentations. I'm not surprised at their excellence. As a matter of fact, when Roger asked me to join this distinguished panel just a couple of weeks ago, I was a substitute, incidentally, I told him that I didn't think that I could add anything to the subtlety, the intelligence, and the splendid articulation that was sure to come from the panel as already constituted. Roger agreed that I could add nothing to those. He said that, as a matter of fact, however, he didn't want any of those things from me. What he wanted me to do was to supply another dimension. He wanted me to talk about this question: who is God in the context of political power? Or doesn't God talk to politicians? Now, that's a nice question. And because I was eager to come here to listen to all the bright people on the stage and in the always extraordinary audience drawn to the 92nd Street Y, I agreed to come and to offer briefly my impressions on that question, that relatively narrow question that touches God and politics. Not quite so personally, perhaps, as the two presenters before me, not quite so impressionistically, but I hope nearly as briefly. And I do it certainly not as a scholar, nor a theologian, nor an apologist, but as an ordinary New Yorker, yes, from Queens, from asphalt streets and stickball, from a poor middle-class neighborhood, a man who made a living, helped raise a family, and found his way, somewhat improbably, into the difficult world of politics. I do it as a person who struggles to keep a belief in God that he has inherited. A Catholic, raised in a religion closer to the peasant roots of the simple Sunday Mass practitioners than to the high intellectual traditions of the Talmudic scholars, the elegant Episcopalian homilists, or abstruse Jesuit teachers. The simple folk of South Jamaica, who came from behind the grocery stores and from the tenements and from the little houses on Liverpool Street, perceived the world then as a sort of cosmic basic training course, filled by God with obstacles and traps to weed out the recruits unfit for eventual service in the heavenly host. The obstacles were everywhere. Our fate on earth was to be the poor, banished children of Eve, mourning and weeping in the vale of tears, until by some combination of grace and good works and luck, we escaped final damnation. Their sense of who God is reflected the collective experience of people who through most of their history had little chance to concern themselves with helping the poor or healing the world's wounds. They were the poor, the wounded. Their poverty and their endless, sometimes losing struggle to feed themselves and hold their families together had varied little across the centuries. It was a cold voice they heard from God on Beaver Road, next to the cemetery across the street from my church, St. Monica's Church, where a famous ex-jockey, one of the homeless winos, froze to death, sleeping in a large wooden crate. It was hard to see God's goodness in the pathetic faces of the customers in our small grocery store, pleading with my father for bread and maybe some cold cuts, just until the next relief check comes, Andrew, please. It got harder still during and after the Second World War, where the best we could say about victory was that the new terror was put down for a while. And a gold star in the window announced that someone's son had been killed. His mother's prayers at St. Monica's never answered. It was difficult to believe that God spoke at Hiroshima either. Who could blame them for feeling that if God were not dead, he must surely be looking in another direction? Vietnam didn't help, nor the terrible, terrible 60s. The sadness of the 60s was, for me, memorialized for all time in The Graduate. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Our nation turns its lonely eyes to you. What's that you say, Mrs. Robinson? Joltin' Joe has left and gone away. And with him all the heroes. No more John F. Kennedy. No more Martin Luther King Jr., no more Bobby Kennedy. Nothing to believe in, nothing to grab hold of, nothing to uplift us. People weren't asking, who is God? They were asking, is God. And for some of us, the awful burden of disbelief became intolerable. The absurdity of a world without explanation was too much to live with. Our intellects pushed to find a rationale, an explanation, an excuse, anything to take the place of despair. Something larger than ourselves to believe in. And if the answer could not be compelled by our shallow intellects, then we pleaded for an answer that at least we could choose to believe without contradicting that intellect. It had to be more than just a God of prohibition, more than just a God of guilt and punishment. It had to be more than John Calvin's chilling conclusion that God loves Jacob but hates Esau, more than Robert Browning's cold and capricious Caliban. It must be a God like the one that was promised in the old books, a God of mercy, a God of peace, a God of hope. In the end, to make sense, it must be a God of love. Now, many of us needed so much to believe in a God that we were in danger, as suggested by the old sinner that Ivan described in the Brothers Karamazov, of making one up. That's how badly we needed it. But we didn't have to make one up. We simply had to be taught, and we were, by one man who was all these things: a scientist, a paleontologist, a person who understood evolution, a soldier who knew the inexplicable evil of the battlefield, a scholar who knew the ages, a philosopher, a theologian, a believer, and a great priest, even a great Jesuit priest, Teilhard de Chardin. He heard our lament, and he answered us. He reoriented our theology and rewrote its language. His wonderful book, The Divine Milieu, dedicated to those who love this world, made negativism a sin. Teilhard glorified the world and everything in it. He taught us how the whole universe, even the pain and the imperfection that we see, is sacred. He taught it in powerful, cogent prose. He taught it in soaring poetry. Faith, he said, is not a call to escape the world, but a call to embrace it. Creation isn't an elaborate testing ground, but an invitation to join in the work of restoration. God created the world, Teilhard told us, but he did not finish it. He left that to us. What an extraordinary reaffirmation of Christian optimism. Think of it. He left it to us to finish the work of creation. Something larger than ourselves to believe in indeed. A whole world to work on. There are other places to work on improving the world than in politics and government, but surely that's a good one. So who is God? He is a voice urging us to be involved and actively working to improve the world that he created every way possible, including through government, because it is a world he loves so much that he made man to enjoy it. This isn't an exotic view exactly. Until recently, most Americans, I think, accepted at least the idea that government was created among us, by us, to promote the general welfare, to protect God's water and soil and air from contamination, to secure decent care for those who can't care for themselves, the sick, the indigent, the homeless, to help people find the dignity of work. Until recently, our history had been largely one of expanding that concept, reaching out to include those once excluded, the women and the blacks, the poor, the disabled. But this belief in benevolent activism, in the commitment of each to the welfare of all, especially to the least among us, is today, as we know now, increasingly attacked and ridiculed and denied. There's a powerful move toward a new ethic for government, one that says, in effect, God helps those whom God has helped. And if God has left you out, who are we to presume on his will by trying to help you? Hardly anyone today denies the ascendancy of this view. Some applaud it as a smarter way. Some reject it as abdication. But most Americans understand that today there is indeed more money for savings and loans, but less for saving addicts. More money for bombs, but less for babies. More rich, more poor than ever. We're presented with a choice. Either we swim with the tide and accept the notion that the best way to improve the world is for government to help the fortunate and then hope that personal charity will induce them to take care of the rest of us. Or we resist by affirming that as we hear God, He tells us it is our moral obligation to be our brother's keeper, all of us, as a people, as a government even, that our responsibility to our brothers and sisters is greater than any one of us, and that it doesn't end when they are out of the individual reach of our hand or our charity or our love. Now, believing that we have an obligation to love, that's not a comfortable position to be in. It can haunt us. It can nag at us in moments of happiness and personal success, disturbing our sleep and giving us that sense of guilt and unworthiness that used to be so strong and that the modern age is so eager to deny. And it can accuse us from the faces of the starving and the dispossessed and the wounded, faces that stare back at us from the front page of our newspaper, images from across the world that blink momentarily on our television screens. I was homeless, the image says, and you gave me theories of supply and demand. I was imprisoned and silenced for justice's sake, and you washed the hands of my torturers. I asked for bread, and you built the world's most sophisticated nuclear arsenal. Teilhard, in just a few magnificent sentences, captured everything I've tried to say here about who today's and eternity's God is. He talked about the Christ as a personal embodiment of that God, and describing our opportunities to involve ourselves in the things of this world. This is what Teilhard wrote. We must try everything for God. Jerusalem, lift up your head. Look at the immense crowds of those who build and those who seek. All over the world, men are toiling in laboratories, in studios, in deserts, in factories, in the vast social crucible. The ferment that is taking place by their instrumentality in art and science and thought is happening for your sake. Open then your arms and your heart, like Christ, and welcome the waters, the flood, accept the juice of humanity. For without its baptism you will wither without desire, like a flower out of water. And tend it, since without your Son it will disperse itself wildly in sterile shoots. Now, to some of us, that is the echo of God at God's most eloquent. No, not an easy matter believing that God commits us to the endless task of seeking improvement of the world around us, knowing that fulfillment is an eternity away. But certainly better than the anguish of futility, better than the emptiness of despair, and capable of bringing meaning to our most modest and clumsy efforts. That's a useful consolation for any of us, and especially for a politician from Queens still struggling to believe. Thank you.
It will not have eluded you that we have heard from a Protestant, a Catholic, and a Jew. The Lower East Side never looked so good. It's interesting. 3 points of view. We come out with a deity absolutely recognizable to all of us. Love, mercy, optimism, moral acts. I understand now that you have written questions, and if I may get such questions from the ushers, we can start there, but maybe while I'm waiting to do that, I can look out and see if someone has a question that he or she would like to deliver just where you are. You may ask a question of any individual panelist or of all three. And since we have such three wonderful panelists, maybe we can persuade all three to answer most of the questions. Yes, ma'am. Who would like to start? Shall I repeat the question? I don't mean by its diminution to make it less, but through personal experience. The questioner was asking, how can we understand a God, a beneficent God, when there is so much evil and one suffers so much in the world? Is that a fair recapitulation? Madeline.
I don't think any of us is going to answer that question. Theologians have been trying to answer it ever since theologians have existed. The closest I've come to it in my own life is that God took a terrible risk by giving us free will. We're not puppets. We're not manipulated. God doesn't have a deterministic universe where everything is already decided. As Teilhard de Chardin said, we are helping to finish creation. Creation is like a new baby, complete, but anything but finished. And if we're given this incredibly dangerous gift of free will, we have abused it. And we can't blame our abuse of free will on God. For my own family, the question came very radically when my husband played the father in The Diary of Anne Frank. And you remember the scene where they're up in the attic and there's a terrible crash downstairs, and the father goes down to investigate it. And for my kids, that was their father going down those stairs. And the mother drops to her knees and she says the whole 121st Psalm, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. And the Lord didn't. And they were captured. They were put in a concentration camp. They all died there except the father. Anne Frank died there. And my kids could not cope with that. They said, why? Anne was good. Anne was good. The Nazis were bad. Innocent people over and over again pay for what the wicked do. But if we're going to have a universe that is not a determined universe where we're mere puppets, then this is a risk that God took, and we have to either affirm that it was a risk worth taking despite all of the anguish and all of the pain, or that we'd rather be puppets. In my own life, there have been many times when I have not understood why the answers to my prayers have been so radically not what I wanted. There is a church in New England where there's carved over the lintel, remember, no is an answer.
All right, you want to talk about that?
I agree with the impossibility of answering why God does bad things, why bad things happen. And even greater minds than ours have struggled with this. What comfort I find is that no matter what bad things happen, God is still there. There's still another day. There's still hope. There's still this presence of God. God gives us another chance, and we should give God another chance, maybe to make our next experience, our next day better.
There's not a great deal I can add to all of that. A couple of dimensions maybe for Christians. There's a convenient notion. Christians accept, or let me say rather Catholics accept the idea that there are some things that are inexplicable and that you can't arrive at through the use of your intellect. That's what faith is. Faith is the acceptance of something that the intellect will tolerate and not condemn, but that the intellect cannot prove. And so we accept the God that we know, not fully understanding all of its dimensions, but not being put off by not understanding it all, because we can choose to believe. All the great writers. There's a book by a rabbi that sold a whole lot of copies about why bad things happen to good people. And Teilhard, if you get the Divine Milieu, the bound copy, and you look at page 55, 54, 53, Teilhard deals with the problem of evil, and he sounds like the rabbi. There are explanations for a part of the evil we contend with, even arguments that some of the evil is good for you. Teilhard makes the point that you can fashion your life around evil. You can, having had the unfortunate experience, use it as a new challenge to configure your life in response to it with high intelligence and thereby grow closer toward saintliness. The evil challenges you to greater heights, the rabbis tell us. They challenge us to become stronger. And then Teilhard offers you the ultimate explanation, and this is how he got into trouble with his church and was ordered not to publish for most of his adult life. Teilhard says that it all comes out right in the end, that we are at work now in a constant process of complexification and growing upward toward God. That it started billions of years ago with non-living matter that grew into living matter, and the living matter grew into humanity, which was self-conscious, and now we are growing brighter and brighter, more and more refined in our intellect, the consciousness of all cultures coming together ultimately into one great unity called the Christ, called heaven, called nirvana, and that eventually it comes out right, and that we are soldiers falling in the battle. But at the end, we win the battle. Now, you can choose to believe that. Why not? Who can disprove it? We have the arrogance to say that unless we know how to prove it, it can't be so. No. If you can disprove it, I will not believe it. If you give me the room to seize consolation, I will seize it. And the older I get, the more firmly I will hold it.
Here's a question for any one of you or all three. You all seem to have assumed that we need a God. Why? Can we not find hope, optimism, good without God?
I would have had to spend the night in Albany.
That goes to our question of hell. But why a God if attached to these qualities of life? Why can't you live with the same virtues, have the same hopes, lead a full, complete moral life without the admission of God?
It gets to be semantic, I think, in part. There are people, I suspect, who call themselves atheists, who believe almost everything that some of us who call ourselves believers believe. So in the end, I think it becomes largely semantic. Theoretically, I guess, God literally has always been taken to mean a single supreme force that has personality, that shares all the attributes of the people who have evolved. In that sense, you limit the number of people who insist on a God. But it is a convenient way to satisfy that terrible hunger we all have for explanation, for rationale. Everybody, almost everybody, has an instinct that says you've got to understand why you're here. The answer to the question is God, in whatever form it takes. So I think what makes God necessary, whatever you call God, is this instinct we're born with to understand, to provide an explanation. You know, we're born cursed with the question, why? God is the answer.
Madeline, is there some virtue in the act of submission itself?
Well, I think some people can live the decent, ordinary, moral lives that has been suggested without God. And what brings me back to God again is the problem of evil. What's going to happen to the kids who are dead with drugs at age 6? What's going to happen to the people who've been thrown out of their houses? What's going to happen to all of the horror in the world? Rather than making me feel God doesn't exist, the problem of evil is for me the real need for God. Because ultimately, in the long run, the end of the story is going to be okay. God is not going to fail with creation.
All right.
Let me take another perspective on that. Maybe God needs us. As the governor said, God created the world, and then we're partners in creation. Maybe we can live full lives without believing, without this God, without what some people call a crutch. But in the larger scheme of things, maybe we're here to help God build the world.
Here's a question that seems tautological, but I know the questioner must have something very interesting in mind. What is the most forgotten aspect of God? And I don't want to hear the answer, I forget. And I assume it means what is the most obscure aspect of God that people don't ordinarily think of first? Think of love, think of mercy, think of justice.
I think this notion of doing something for God, of service, in my tradition, it means doing mitzvahs, doing what the ritual acts that I was talking about kind of bring a little of the godliness to my life. We forget that maybe God needs us to light the candle, that he needs us to pray. That's a very hard concept because this all-powerful being needs us. But I think that's a forgotten aspect of God.
I agree with Ari, but I would add humor, a sense of humor, a sense of laughter. I think God has an extraordinary sense of humor, frequently at my expense. Just one example, I was going to be speaking at Mundelein College in Chicago, which is Roman Catholic. From there to Wheaton College, which is evangelical. From there to the Episcopal Diocese of Idaho, a nice ecumenical trip. And between Mundelein and Wheaton, I could feel myself coming down with a heavy laryngeal cold. Everything was tightening up. And I said, "Dear Lord, please, I have 11 more talks to give. Please don't let me lose my voice." Within 24 hours, I had the worst attack of intestinal flu I have ever had. My voice was fine. My bishop says that you cannot have humility without humor, and they both come from the same root, humus, earth, earthy.
Here's a question, if I smell it right, had to come from one of my colleagues in the press. Where was God today during the vote for Thomas? Governor, where was she?
I have to remember how I answered this question on the way in, because by now it's already appeared. I think it's very, very difficult to know whether or not a just result was achieved as between Professor Hill and Judge Thomas on the question of sexual harassment, where I think all the focus has come down, obscuring the basic question, which was, should he be on the Supreme Court to begin with? I had made the judgment that he ought not to be on the Supreme Court because he simply wasn't at a level of excellence that would qualify him to So that, I think maybe God would like us to be constructive and try to find some redeeming aspect to the situation. Pardon the use of the word. And I think there is one. I think at the very least what we can allow to survive from this experience that would be useful is the issue of sexual harassment. The thing that probably will be most enduring about this experience is the expression of pain, anguish, anger, confusion, especially among the women of the country, on the question of sexual harassment generically. It goes far beyond Professor Hill and Norman Thomas, well, we should be so lucky, and Judge Thomas. I think what ought to happen now, and we're going to try to do something about it in this state, in 1983, I adopted an executive order, I signed an executive order on the question of sexual harassment. I said this is a real issue. It's not well understood, it's not well dealt with by men particularly, nor by women, and we ought to be studying it. I think what will happen after today is that you will find our state and other governments readdressing the issue of sexual harassment, studying it, dealing with it, trying to educate people on it. It's a very, very big issue. Until now, it hasn't surfaced. Until now, there was no opportunity to measure its impact on the American people. It had a tremendous impact that went far beyond Professor Hill. And if we do something on that issue that's useful, then I think God will be pleased.
Let me leave these questions for a moment to ask if there are any questions that someone would like to ask from the audience. Yes, sir.
I just want to return to the first question. Actually, I wasn't aware that they would be collected. But after I heard the first question, I thought of a similar question. Why do many people find it, educated people, find it easy, very easy to believe or admit the existence of God, but very difficult to conceive of the existence of the devil or Satan or whatever you want to call it?
Satan in Hebrew, I guess, is the adversary. And I believe in an adversary. If you like, you can call him Satan. I'm not going to mess around right now on that issue. The Catholic Church, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not a theologian, I'm not an expert on canon law certainly, but my understanding is that we teach and believe in evil and evil propensity and temptation. This is not to say we believe in the Satan of The Exorcist, but we do believe in the existence of evil in the world and an inclination to do bad things, to hurt, to kill. We call it Satan, and so we accept the notion.
Satan doesn't come up too often in Scripture, but I find it fascinating that in the beginning of Job, God is calling his sons, I'm not sure where the daughters were, but he's calling his sons all around him, and Satan is one of them, still. Satan is still there. And how terribly lonely at that point he must feel for having fallen on the primordial human flaw of pride, of usurping the prerogatives of the gods. So that Satan and evil are not something outside God and good, but are good gone wrong, good turned sour and bad. And so there's always the hope that ultimately it will turn good again.
Here's a question that says, is the official motto, "In God We Trust," valid under the First Amendment? And I suppose this question goes generally to the place of God or spirituality or specific religious belief in a country that has worked assiduously to separate the church and state.
Harvard would understand that issue best. Well,
Well, he's thinking.
Go ahead.
I get a lot of mail, and I can't answer it all. But the other day, Billy Graham was in Central Park, and everybody was happy and thought that this is a great event. And then someone wrote me a letter saying, is this an appropriate use for a public park? I mean, after all, to have an evangelist there talk about, coming to Christ and being saved. The Dalai Lama is going to be in Central Park next week for a sunrise service. People will be meditating, in the Buddhist tradition. And is this an appropriate use? We have that going on, and it was like a good question. I'm not sure why that's appropriate and why putting up a creche in Central Park is inappropriate.
I think, may I?
Please.
I think that part of the difficulty is that you tend to think of the separation of church and state as a real and impenetrable wall, and there is no such thing. There never was. As a matter of fact, even the language has been a distortion. It came out of a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, and it was never intended to describe a constitutional reality that separates the church and the state perfectly. If that were true, the Hebrew Academy would have to pay for the picking up of its garbage by the Department of Sanitation, because this is taxpayers making a contribution to the synagogue or the church. You wouldn't be able to have chaplains because we pay for chaplains. The Everson case, and this is all the product of many, many years of litigation and jurisprudence in this country. Leo Pfeffer was the great Jewish leader who years ago argued in the Supreme Court of the United States against every coming together of church and state, even the picking up of garbage. But we have made accommodations. The rule generally is that we will not allow the government to support religion, advance religion. If that is the primary purpose of what you do, to advance religion, then it is wrong. Tax exemptions. You give tax exemptions to religious groups of all kinds. You don't do that to advance religion. You do that theoretically, and this has survived constitutional scrutiny. You do that because of the usefulness of the purpose. If they're schools, etc., they have a generic value to the whole society. So we have a loose arrangement that tolerates certain religious expressions like "in God we trust," like chaplains, like the opening of legislative sessions with prayers, that tolerates it if the Supreme Court can reasonably say that it's the direct purpose of the law is not in a substantial way to help religion. For years, I went to PS 50. I'll never forget it. And PS 142, Edgar Dubs Scheimer Junior High School. In both schools, I remember assemblies where they read from the Psalms. David, remember? That was easy in public school. You can't do it anymore since Engel against Vitale. Why? Because they decided on a new approach to church-state. You needn't go into the case. The point is, this is a loose, penetrable wall between church and state. It has many, many exceptions. Once you understand that, then you don't get troubled by questions like the one that was asked.
I have one more question here, and then we'll take one more from the audience. I don't know to whom this is directed. I assume it's Ari and Madeline. If God told you to run for president, would you?
If God at the same time promised to balance the state budget while I was schlepping in Iowa, maybe, yes.
May we have one more question from the audience? And not a repetition of the last question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I would like to ask the panel how they stand on the very closely related matter of hereafter, heaven, and God's role in this. That's the government.
thank you for the adjectives.
Why don't we answer that question of the hereafter in order of the speakers? So Madeline, would you answer first? The question was, do you believe in a hereafter?
There's a longing in the human soul to be completed. I know that if I had died when that truck ran into me, I was not yet finished. I don't think that a God of love creates and then annihilates or abandons. That's simply something that I say, this is what I feel, this is what I believe, that we need to be finished. We need to go on to learn all of the things that we need to learn. When I was 8 years old, and we're all good theologians when we're 8, I had my first encounter with death, the death of somebody I loved, and it was a bass baritone at the Metropolitan Opera. He was a love uncle, and he was a big man with a big voice and a big laugh, and he could throw me up in the air, and suddenly he was gone. And it never occurred to me to interrupt my parents' grief to ask them anything. And so, age 8, I postulated a planet on which nobody had any eyes. And of course, they would compensate perfectly well and get along. But if one of us went to that planet and tried to describe the sunset over the Hudson, or a smile, or a daffodil blooming, it simply could not be done. And so, age 8, I decided that when we die, we get something just as marvelous as sight. But just as we couldn't possibly explain it to somebody on that eyeless planet, so nobody can explain to us now what God still has in store for us. I haven't gone much further than that 8-year-old theology. I still think it's pretty good.
Ari?
Well, it's probably the hardest thing to believe in because it's unknown. And we have this longing to believe in a hereafter. All of our traditions, the three of them represented here, believe in some sort of hereafter. My complaint with Jewish education is that no one ever tells you what's going to happen. There's a much better structure. I know more about what's going to happen to them than I know what's going to happen to me. There's a whole hierarchy and all this stuff going on, and you sit this level and that level and up or down. And the Jews always talk about it, but it's just very poorly thought. Well, I don't know if there's a discomfort with it that I would like, and I would like to know more about it.
The thing that's always intrigued me about the hereafter, at least over the last, since Vatican Council II, is what I think is a change in emphasis in the Catholic Church. When I grew up in the Jimmy Breslin era, when girls were not allowed to wear patent leather shoes, and where there were various punishments assigned for various sins. For some of them, you would go blind, and there was certainly hell. There was certainly hell. If anything was important, it was hell. It was punishment. It was a very negative kind of time. I remember going for one day to St. Monica's. I went from PS 50, and it went only up to the 6th grade, and you had a choice of going to Edgar Dubs Scheimer Junior High School or to St. Monica's, and because I was an altar boy, some of the priests said, you ought to go to the Catholic. So I went for one day to the Sisters of Charity and did something wrong, and one of them hit me with a ruler. I quit. On the spot, I did. It was a terrible shot. I thought of them for all time thereafter, no longer as the Sisters of Charity, but as the Sisters of Justice. But in the church, for example, we used to say, I think the Episcopalians continue to say the creed that we used to say, the Apostles' Creed. And in the old Apostles' Creed, we said, died, descended into hell, and on the third day he rose again from the dead, ascended into heaven. We no longer say, descended into hell. From the Second Vatican Council on, we de-emphasized the negative, de-emphasized hell, spoke more and more about an eternity of fulfillment, got closer and closer indeed to the Teod proposition, which is that we are all growing up toward perfection, and that in the fullness of time, the whole world will come together in consciousness and perfection. And that will be heaven. We now, those of us who think of ourselves as members of the church, swear an oath. We accept a certain body of basic beliefs, and part of it is a belief in a life hereafter, a resurrection of the body and a life hereafter. I choose to believe it. Again, you cannot dissuade me with intellectual arguments. All you can say to me is, I can't prove it. But Madeline's right. Why not choose to believe it as long as it can't be disproved? And that is, I think, the position of many Catholics. We're delighted to be able to accept a belief in heaven and relieved not to have to be as insistent about a belief in hell.
We do in the Episcopal Church still mention hell. However, we also believe that on Great and Holy Saturday, the day between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, Jesus was down in hell emptying it. He pulled Moses out, he pulled Adam out, he pulled Eve out. And having told two Jewish stories, I'd like to tell one small Christian one of a wonderful, good, traditional man who died and went to heaven, and St. Peter met him at the gates, kissed him on both cheeks, flung open the pearly gates, and he wandered in a daze of bliss. And it was everything he'd been taught to believe, golden streets and milk and honey blessed. And he walked and he walked and he didn't see anybody. He walked for about an hour. He didn't see anybody. He went back to the pearly gates. He said, St. Peter, yes, my son, this is heaven? Oh, yes, my son, don't you like it? Well, yes, it's wonderful. It's everything I was taught to believe. But where are the prophets? Where are the saints? Where's the Holy Family? Where is everybody? And St. Peter said, oh, them? Oh, well, they're all down in hell ministering to the damned. If you'd like to join them, I'll show you the way.
Madeline, the Episcopalians teach that you emptied out hell. I hope that's not to make room for the Catholics.
My heaven is very ecumenical, Governor.
One of the wonderful things about talking about subjects like this at the 92nd Street Y is that we have a theater in which one can ask very difficult, sensitive, and potentially contentious questions comfortably and among friends. We were blessed to have three such thoughtful and good panelists. We thank them, and we thank you. Good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on 92nd Street Y and all of our programs, please visit us on the web. This program is copyright 1991 by 92nd Street Y.